webinar is titled Beneficial Electrification, New Research on Emissions Reduction and Cost Savings for Vermont. We're going to be talking about two recent papers, one that was written by EAN Senior Fellow Lee Seddon and recently published on the EAN website about emissions reduction related to beneficial electrification. And then a related topic is a recent paper which was produced for the Agency of Natural Resources and the Vermont Climate Council, produced by David Hill, who's a managing consultant with Energy Futures Group, looking at the potential savings of beneficial electrification in a much broader scope of a paper of looking at the marginal abatement costs or savings of different measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the flow for today is that Lee and David will present some slides in order, each for about 15 minutes. And then afterwards, we will have a Q&A. So if you look at the bottom bar of this Zoom webinar screen, you'll see the Q&A. Feel free to type in a question as you have it. And then towards the end, if there are questions that others have asked that you agree with, that you'd like to see posed, feel free to react to that, to give it a thumbs up, which will help me as a moderator and facilitator in terms of identifying which questions to prioritize posing to Lee and David after they have presented. And I'll just mention this is being recorded. So it will be available if you miss part of it or if you want to share it. And then we will also, David and Lee have graciously agreed to make available their slides, which we will post with this video in addition to the direct links to the papers themselves. So without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce Lee Seddon. Lee has been with Energy Action Network for over a decade, most recently as a senior fellow, but his research and contributions to EAN have stretched a very long time, including the original 90% renewable by 2050 pathways analysis conducted in 2013, contributing to almost every single one of our annual progress reports for Vermont. And so we're really excited about this new piece of research he's published. And then he'll be followed by David, who has a similarly long and impressive career doing energy work, most recently with Energy Futures Group as a managing consultant, and before that at VEIC, the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, as their director of distributed resources and as a policy fellow. So we're really grateful to both of them for taking the time to be with us today and for doing this really important work that they're about to share with you now. So with that, I will turn it over to Lee.
Great. Thank you, Jared. I will share my screen. And there we go. First of all, I want to thank all of the consultants and agency people who reviewed this paper and gave me great feedback on what was right and what was wrong. Anything that's wrong is my problem, but it's been something I've been working on over the summer. The first thing I want to say is to measure the greenhouse gas emissions from our electric sector. We really need to look at the contract paths that our utilities have, which make up the Vermont portfolio. We're part of ISO New England, and here's a little map that shows the areas of ISO New England electric system with connections to Hydro-Quebec, HQ, Quebec, connections to New York, NIPA Power, and New Brunswick. And all of these sources feed in. Vermont has its own unique contracts. ISO New England also tracks air emissions from every generator over 5 megawatts and publishes an annual report. So it tracks these on an hourly basis, and it's the start of actually getting some concrete data about our electric emissions. But as we start off, ISO New England has emissions of about 288 kilograms carbon dioxide equivalent per megawatt hour. It's one of the cleanest regions in the United States. But when we look at Vermont's portfolio, my research shows that it's at least 15 times cleaner than the ISO New England mix. There are various frameworks for looking at GHG emissions. 3 that are looked at in my paper are the current Agency of Natural Resources inventory method, which mainly looks at combustion emissions, smokestack emissions from our generators. The NREL, National Renewable Energy Lab Cambium model, which looks at emissions, but also pre-combustion emissions. So for fossil gas generators, this includes getting the natural gas, cleaning it, putting it in the pipeline, transmitting it to the generator, and the pipeline leakages that happen along that way. And when you do this source energy accounting, which includes pre-combustion and combustion, you get a much clearer picture of the real footprint of our electric contracts. Finally, there's life cycle assessment, LCA, and this is very interesting also. Vermont has hired consultants who will be producing a report with initial results maybe at the beginning of next year, which cover the full emissions from construction, fuel cycle, operation, and decommissioning. So starting off, looking at Vermont's portfolio, on the left are all the generating fuel types that we get, and each utility reports all their contracts to the PSD, and this is generated into a spreadsheet annually. And what this shows is our 2020 contracts in megawatt hours over here, and the GHG emissions attributed by the ANR methodology to it. ANR methodology says solar, wind, hydro are all zero emissions. So is nuclear power, zero emissions. So what really counts in their methodology is the ISO New England system mix here, right there, which has a lot of fossil gas in it, and any gas peakers that we have in Vermont. But overall, the result is that the average annual emissions are about 12 kilograms per megawatt hour for our portfolio, according to ANR in 2020. When we look at the NREL model, the Cambium model, which includes pre-combustion, this changes, and there are pre-combustion emissions for obviously our fossil generators, but also for Hydro-Quebec. Hydro-Quebec here is shown as having pre-combustion and operational emissions of 24 kilograms per megawatt hour. That's mainly due to the reservoirs, the boreal reservoirs, increased methane release over what's naturally happening up there. And the best paper on both the life cycle and operational emissions of Hydro-Quebec was done by Levasseur in 2021, looked at every reservoir, every generator, all the imports from New Brunswick, and looked at their life cycle emissions. This is 24 is just the operational emissions. The life cycle emissions, which include the concrete dams and things, is higher, about 32 kilograms. So when we do this pre-combustion, our greenhouse gas emissions double to 24 kilograms per megawatt hour. Still, that's under 15 times lower than the ISO New England mix. And what's been really important in the past few years is that utilities have gotten off of using the residual mix, which has very high carbon content. And because it's now about 2% of the energy we use, that has dramatically reduced our greenhouse gas emissions from electricity. Finally, there's life cycle assessment, which is the full building of a plant, fuel cycle operation downstream. And the one thing I want to point out about this is it's highly variable. NREL has been studying life cycle emissions for the last decade and has produced what they call a harmonization report. But just looking at natural gas here, you can see the range from 1,000 down to about 300 kilograms per megawatt hour of the studies that they looked at. And the median is down here at about 500. But the range results from all the different types of plants. And so my takeaway from that is if you're doing life cycle, you really need to know what plant you're looking at. Hydro-Quebec is very different than a run-of-river hydro facility in Vermont. The run-of-river might have very close to zero life cycle emissions. Hydro-Quebec does not. So I'll leave that there. And finally, the paper looks at REC accounting, renewable energy certificates. We have to count after renewable energy certificates because they're the legal means for identifying what the environmental attributes of your power are. And when we look at Vermont in 2020, what's interesting is the about 70% of the post-REC is all hydropower. And this leads to a annual average figure of about 13 kilograms per megawatt hour. These RECs are both bundled with power and unbundled, but any unbundled REC has to have a transmission route and be deliverable to ISO New England. So the RECs really do capture the regional carbon content, even if they're unbundled. In perspective, we can see that even the highest number, the Cambium model using the pre-construction emissions, pre-combustion is 16 times lower than ISO New England at 404. So these three groups are using the Cambium model. The second part of the paper looks at the future impact of beneficial electrification. The reason this is important is often the short-run marginal emission rate from ISO New England, which is heavily fossil gas dependent, is used as the proxy for what the emissions will be from a new heat pump or a new EV. And so our marginal ISO New England emissions right now are 428 kilograms, quite high. But what this ignores is one, Vermont's portfolio is quite a bit cleaner, and two, the entire region is transforming over time as it decarbonizes. And papers written by NREL researchers have started to use long-run marginal emission rates, LR, MER. And what these are, they have modeled the hourly emissions costs for the entire US electric system, have various scenarios of its transformation. And you can actually pick out in the Cambium model specific regions like ISO New England or even states. But what this does is it looks at what the emissions will be over the next 15 or 20 years, not just today. And that's so important for understanding what a heat pump that'll last 15 years or an EV will do. Here is a table of long-run marginal emission rates over a 15-year period. And it's done for all the states in the Northeast. This is derived from the Cambium model. And you'll see that it has different periods. These are each 15-year periods. And the emission rates change during those periods. And so these can be thought of as sort of average emission rates over that entire time. But if you look at the Cambium model's emission rates for any 15-year period going out, that is 4 kilograms per megawatt hour. That's 100 times lower than the ISO New England current marginal emission rate. And it goes up over time as the Cambium model thinks we'll have to have more natural gas or other backup for our resources. So one thing I did in the papers, I looked at an EV, I also looked at fuel oil, and this is an example of a whole home retrofit, taking a number 2 fuel oil furnace and replacing it with a cold climate heat pump system. 40% of our households heat with oil, and so this is pretty important about what beneficial electrification can do. The upshot is that the annual emissions of a furnace are over 7,000 kilograms CO2e. Electricity using the average long-run marginal rate from Cambium is 469. And what that means is that over a 15-year period, doing a whole home retrofit, switching off number 2 fuel oil, will reduce emissions 94%. It shows how important beneficial electrification is for Vermont. Finally, I look at how we might in Vermont start getting hourly profiles of our emissions, because hourly profiles are more important than seasonal or annual emissions, because heat pumps and EVs may be operating at peak times. This is a profile from May of 2021. You can see the morning peak right here when heating loads are coming on, and you can see the evening peak, which is even higher. This is the Champ curve, if you will. That's solar and other renewables kicking in and lowering demand. But what's important is to look at how we might mitigate the peak periods and higher emission periods of both heat pumps and EVs. So here's a chart from SEI that went to the Climate Council showing the seasonal peaks of a heat pump. And here is the winter peak right there for heating, but there's also a summer peak for cooling that will come. So not only is it important to understand how to control these loads, but the emissions are different. So I make a pitch for Vermont creating its own Cambium model, which has hourly profiles going forward into the future that we can use. But the upshot is that beneficial electrification can reduce emissions from our fossil sources over 90% in the coming years. So I will stop right there. My 15 minutes are up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lee. And at this point, we're going to transition right into David Hill and his slides. And then just a reminder that if you have questions for either Lee or for David on anything they've presented, or if you've had the chance to review their papers ahead of time and want to pose a question from them, just use the Q&A box at the bottom bar. And then after David finishes presenting, we will sort through those and see which ones have the most thumbs up. And as moderator, I'll bring some of those forward for Lee and or David to answer. But with that, David, please go ahead. Thank you so much for joining us. Oh, David, you're muted still.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Jared, and thanks, Lee. And thank you to everybody for joining today, spending some of your lunchtime to look at these results. I appreciate the work that Lee has done. What I'm going to present today is work that we, as Jared said, presented as kind of wrapping up our work for the ANR on pathways analysis. I want to recognize colleagues at Cadmus, other colleagues at EFG and SEI who also contributed to this work, but I'll go through these slides relatively quickly to give you an overview of the marginal abatement cost curve, the methods, and the results that we had. So let's see, slide advance, there we are. So just to, I'm not sure if everybody on the webinar today is fully familiar, but we used the low emissions analysis platform, the LEAP model, to conduct a pathways analysis to support the Vermont Climate Council. These show the requirements for the GWSA in each time period and the results for what's called the full mitigation scenario. And so we can see here that the mitigation scenario meets the requirements in each of the time periods. And then further questions or more granular level of development was to look at the marginal abatement cost curve. So the cost per ton of individual measures within that, within the portfolio. So this slide represents the net economic benefits for the total mitigation pathway scenario. Savings are above the 0 point on the zero axis here. So we have avoided fuel consumption and avoided social, economic, and environmental damages with total savings of about 22 billion. This is over the 2015 to 2050 time period with a 2% discount rate, and then additional investments of about $16 billion in the different sectors related to the different activities that are in the mitigation scenario. And when we net these out, $16 billion of investments and $22 billion of savings, there's a total net present value of savings of $6.4 billion. So the marginal abatement cost curve then dives into a bit more detail to look at what the individual components of this are, but we want to recognize that the entire CAP mitigation scenario has substantial net economic benefits. So some of the key questions that the MAC curve, I'll use the term MAC curve, marginal abatement cost curve, is meant to address. What are the mitigation potentials and the net costs per ton for each of the measures? And each measure, it's in quotes here, measures are bundles of activities. So heat pumps, there are tens of thousands of heat pumps that will be going in. So it's not an individual heat pump, but a measure, say for cold climate heat pumps or heat pump water heaters, electric vehicles, et cetera. So these are bundled into measures. And we wanted to look at a difference between the medium term, so up through 2030, measures that were implemented through 2030 versus a longer term out to 2050, differences between the cost curves. And then 3, just thinking about, well, how can the marginal abatement cost curves in this analysis be best used to inform policy and program design looking forward? And where too do we see questions that come up that deserve further attention and analysis? The chart on the right shows again an output from the initial pathways analysis. This is another look at that. This now breaks it out. What I showed earlier was a combined stacked column with the net present value over time. This now is in each time period. The benefits being the avoided fuel and then the avoided emissions or the environmental externalities, again above 0. And then these are the additional investments going on below with a net curve showing in annual periods this type of profile. So what we did to create the MAC curve, we had to adjust some of the cost profiles that were in the initial LEAP model. And then we wanted to look at what we do is take the entire CAP mitigation scenario and then subtract individual measures from that. So we're looking at the impact of each individual measure on the whole the marginal change, if you took a certain measure out of a compliant portfolio, which is the GWSA cap mitigation portfolio, if you take out individual measures, what's the change in cost and what's the change in avoided emissions? For the medium term, we counted implementation up through 2030 and then a baseline that was frozen after 2030 to 2050 to try to give an idea of, in the near term, what are the marginal costs and abatement potential. And then for the long term, it's implementation savings of both fuel and investments and everything that goes out through 2050. So this is a couple slides here that just show the examples, and then I'll give the more detailed discussion of the curve itself. But each bar in these, this is a variable width column chart. The width of the bar represents the amount of emissions reduction, the total amount of emissions reduction. So the wider bars represent a larger amount of emissions reduction, and narrower bars are less. And then on the vertical axis, you have below zero, you have negative costs, so savings for measures that are below that, and then going up, these are costs per metric ton of savings above that. So we've also developed some categories here. For instance, the electrification, strategic electrification are orange, building measures are blue here, transportation are yellow. So there's some non-energy is green, renewable energy is blue. There's a dashed line here representing the social cost of carbon. This was based on prior federal guidelines. The levelized cost that was adopted by the Vermont Climate Council, the levelized value is $146 per ton of CO2e avoided. There are updates to the federal social cost of carbon that would be higher than this now, around 185. But we use this dotted line to represent the social cost of carbon. Points to keep in mind as I present the results here are that the full portfolio of measures in the initial cap are cost effective. And what you wouldn't want to do is say, well, we're going to trim off the more expensive ones, because the full portfolio is what you need generally to be meeting the requirements. Higher cost measures actually may require support, incentives and support to be happening. And then lower cost measures don't necessarily, all of these are changes from a baseline. So they're not assumed to be happening by themselves. So we still may need policy and program design, incentive support, et cetera, to get the reductions that we're looking at here. This is the medium term, a table for the medium term marginal abatement curve. And what we see, as I said before, we see first of all the categories, kind of some categorization, bundling things, ICE and ethanol, 15 sustainable aviation fuel, B20 for biodiesel and VMT. These are all yellow. These are electrifications, building shell, non-energy. These are kind of renewable fuels in renewable gas for industry, renewable gas for buildings, B100 for heating, B100 for industry. And then what we see is the cumulative abatement potential. Again, these will show up as the width of each one of the variable column widths. And then this is the cost per ton, or excuse me, the cumulative discounted cost. We divide those and we get the cost per ton. So this is the medium term. And again, with medium term, then we froze implementation after 2030 and compared to a baseline where it is frozen after 2030. And what we see are most of the measures, 90% of the savings are below the social cost of carbon. There are electrification, building shells, advanced wood heating all have negative costs, so savings. The phase out of internal combustion engines by 2035 has, I think, the widest bar here. Non-energy measures are important, and these are some of the blending and things. Note that the renewable energy, the changes in the near term, renewable energy standards are incorporated up through 2030. They're incorporated in the baseline So there is not a specific bar until we get to the longer term view for the renewable energy measures. This is the long-term abatement curve. Same type of structure. What we see is managed EV charging and renewable electricity. These are some new measures that out through the longer term are showing up. There is a bit of an anomaly where building shells and advanced wood heating, both of these, I think that there's still some questions that we're trying to sort through with the modeling. These have gone from, in the medium curve, these are on the far left side. Advanced wood heating and building shells are both negative costs, high negative costs. When we look at the longer term, they have switched over to the far side, and so they're represented here. That's something that there's some peculiarities in the modeling that is still being discussed and reviewed and worked out. Interpreting the results, more than 90% of the emissions in both the medium and long term have net costs that are less than the social cost of carbon. Each of the measures, again, there are many investments and actions that are required to get these. These are tens of thousands of individual investments and actions represented by the columns and the bars here in these charts. The measures are beyond what's baseline, and so therefore, even the ones that have savings shouldn't be assumed to happen through the market activities just by themselves. There can still be required policy or programmatic support. The medium-term results indicate what we need to be on track to meet the requirements, but that post-2030, there will still be actions necessary. Over time, as the mix of energy resources become less carbon intensive, the abatement potential for efficiency declines, but it's still important, and particularly during the first decade. Many measures provide additional savings and benefits that are not captured by the MAC curve, and that those can be considered in individual measure or program cost effectiveness testing. This doesn't replace the need for those. And then the MAC analysis and kind of tearing the MAC analysis apart can also help us to provide inputs and then help define the need for further analyses. So that, I think, I stayed pretty close to the 15 minutes. That's a very rapid review of those results, but yeah, happy to join the discussion and take questions.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you, Lee, as well. Looks like there are a number of questions that have been entered in the Q&A, and just in case folks do not see it, when you look at the questions that have been posed, in the lower left-hand corner, there's like a little thumbs up icon. If you like that question and want to see it prioritized to be answered, click that thumbs up. So we'll go through them in that way of priority. So the first question, and just in the interest of time and to minimize the possibility of technical difficulties, I'll go ahead and pose these as moderator rather than changing video and having people ask these directly. But Jeff, thanks for joining. I'm glad you're with us. Lee, Jeff asks that the duck curve you showed implied that solar and renewables dramatically reduced midday peaks. Do you feel that there are ways to develop new solar moving forward that might impact the new evening peaks? I'm thinking east-west facing solar orientation and using storage to even out the belly of the duck curve.
Well, that's a great question. I've worked in solar most of my life. And it is, we're getting saturated with solar that doesn't have storage. So that duck curve is great. It's reducing our midday peaks, and it's mostly effective in the summertime, not so much in winter. We got to realize Vermont is a very northern state, and our output in winter from solar is not great. But the way to basically increase the usefulness of solar is to combine it with storage. So this can either be batteries, which are coming down in cost, or other methods such as using that extra capacity during midday to do thermal storage in houses. Take a hot water heater. We can pump that hot water heater up 10 degrees more using surplus solar, and that will serve as a battery. So there are ways. I do think solar is going to be important to continue to develop in Vermont, but right now its value has fallen because it is not cutting the peak loads as it used to be. And I'll just point out that Green Mountain Power started the first solar incentives because solar was so valuable to them, above 20 cents a kilowatt hour, that they offered to pay that 4-cent premium. Now that isn't the case anymore, given our curves, but that doesn't mean we have to stop solar.
Great. Thanks, Lee. So there's actually two questions from Rich. One, which is, I think, a fairly straightforward question about your paper, Lee, and then one is a broader one. So I'm just going to ask them both together. The first one is, when comparing the emissions from number 2 fuel oil to a whole house cold climate air source heat pump, did you include any factor for backup combustion, or do you assume that the furnace is removed entirely and the heat pump system alone will cover the coldest days? So that's one specific question. The broader question that Rich followed up with is that some people argue that since Vermont's electricity mix is already so relatively clean, new renewables are not needed and would not reduce emissions. But wouldn't a new renewable energy standard in Vermont tend to avoid emissions at the regional marginal emissions rate, which is much higher?
Oh, those are good questions. That's really complicated. I might give the second one to David. But the first one was, the model I showed is a whole house retrofit, and heat pumps can, like this place, can easily do a whole house without any fossil fuel backup, but the house needs to be fairly tight and weatherized. That doesn't always have to be the case. You can model a fossil fuel backup where heat pumps basically stop operating at about 5 degrees. And the results are sort of the same, but the point is that you can you don't have to have fossil backup. And some people have argued that you have to have fossil backup so we can reduce the peaks, because that heat pump can't be operating during peak conditions. But with thermal storage and mass, that's really not an issue. So that's that first question. David, do you want to sort of tackle David knows more about solar than I do. Is solar still valuable, and does it reduce the ISO New England natural gas use? So.
Well, I think it is a very good question, and I think, Lee, as you said, it really depends kind of on the contractual, different pathways. So Vermont could serve to, I don't think Vermont has been, but Vermont could serve to help reduce regional emissions, right? If we are providing lower emission sources onto the grid. And so I think that there's the marginal emissions for the region could become lower if Vermont had, contractual paths so that our contributions are, showing up in reduced emissions and reduced operations for plants out of state.
Thanks, David. Another question for you, and this is from Jean Terwilliger. Jean, I hope I pronounced your last name correctly. And this actually, it may be something you want to comment on as well, Lee. And I think relates to the question about the first question that Rich asked. Is advanced wood heat, do you see advanced wood heat being necessary for decarbonization to accommodate winter heating loads? Or could Vermont go to fully electric heating? I would just, moderator's prerogative, would ask you to comment on the kind of timescale related to that question. I think that there's many folks who probably hope that longer term that will be possible, but there's a lot of steps in the near and medium term that would be necessary to enable that. Can you speak to what you see in your kind of forecasting and modeling about how much of our Vermont's heating load can be met through efficient electric uses like heat pumps versus how much combustion energy will be necessary to meet Vermont's heating load over different timescales?
Yeah, I think that it depends. It will depend on the existing heating systems in the households. And so it's not, we don't, the LEAP modeling and the pathways analysis doesn't assume that 100% for all households or for all commercial businesses is met by electric. And as you said, over time that can change. There may be some that if a house has been fully weatherized and the space configuration is suitable, or there are different system types, you can meet, the large majority or all of the needs through the heat pump without the need for supplemental any kind of combustion. For others, you may still have some backup of the existing system. People may leave their existing system in, or you may have supplemental wood heat, et cetera. So I think that it's a mix, and over time, I think both for the economics of it as well as because, as Lee has pointed out, the emissions factors for the Vermont's electric grid, even under the most conservative assumptions, is much cleaner than the combustion of fossil fuels, combustion of fuels. So, but it will depend. It's not that Vermont strictly is, there's not a requirement that you're going to meet 100% of heating loads through electrification starting immediately.
And I would just add to that currently over 20% of our thermal heating loads comes from biofuels, both residential, commercial, and industrial. And 20% of our thermal load is really significant. You're not going to snap your fingers and make that disappear, but we can make it cleaner through things like the Clean Heat Standard. We can get advanced wood heating equipment out and retire non-EPA compliant stoves much quicker than would happen normally. And as a low-cost heating resource, wood has always proved to be the most stable, longest term, lowest cost heating source for Vermonters. So it will not ever probably disappear entirely, but we can make it a lot cleaner, and people will decide when electricity heat pumps are cheap enough that they're tired of stacking wood. So I imagine it will drop significantly by 2050, but not so much right in the near term.
I might just offer that it's an interesting comparison, the kind of buildings and heating side with our transportation sector. If you look at Vermont's vehicle fleet, 70% of all vehicles registered in Vermont are model years within the last decade. So, 70% of the fleet is turning over each decade. In contrast, those 40% of Vermont homes that have fuel oil as a primary heating source, most of those are fuel oil furnaces and boilers that can have a lifespan of 20, 25 years. And so the rate of change out and the amount of sunk investment in that infrastructure is a lot higher and a lot more challenging than on the vehicle side. So I think that's an interesting point of comparison to look at as we compare those sectors and those measures. But it leads to another question from Jeff, which, if it's all right, Jeff, I'm just going to change the wording life cycle to the lifespan of the measure, because I think oftentimes with life cycle, we can get confused with life cycle emissions. But it says, David, when you talk about the negative cost for measures, AKA savings of measures, are you talking about the lifespan costs or savings in the analysis? And if so, there may be high upfront costs, but low, lifetime costs or savings. Can you talk about that and whether we'll need to heavily incentivize those kinds of measures to get the uptake levels needed?
It's a good question. Thank you, Jeff. So yeah, this is not necessary. The answer is yes, it's taking the lifespan, so the costs and savings over the equipment life into account. And so those will provide savings to the customer, but it's not a customer's perspective analysis. So any incentive that comes, say, from the Inflation Reduction Act or from Efficiency Vermont or Vermont Gas Systems or BED, those aren't incorporated into this. And both in incentive level and financing to get these to happen, those are important kind of policy and program design functions. And those need to be kind of solidly grounded on the customer's perspective, which is likely to have a higher discount rate than a social discount rate. It needs to look at the costs and benefits for the financial, entity, the household budget or the business budget. So incentivization is in programs and policy support. We don't need to over incentivize those, but we do need to be aware that the customer's perspective to get the adoption rates that we need is an important piece that this is more at the societal level analysis.
Thanks, David. Before going, the next question I want to ask is from Brian Woods at the Department of Environmental Conservation. But before I ask it, I want to take moderator's prerogative to ask a question that is related to something we were discussing earlier, and I believe related to Brian's question. You were showing, David, how in the medium term, the 2030 analysis, that building shell improvements like weatherization and advanced wood heating were delivering some of the highest lifetime savings, or the lowest net negative cost or savings in the marginal abatement cost curve. But then looking at 2050, they kind of flipped to the right-hand side of the graph, and we're showing a higher cost per ton avoided. I'm wondering if part of that is because did the analysis, not just in terms of emissions, but also in terms of costs and savings, have to get cut off at 2050, and therefore wouldn't that potentially hurt particularly long-lived measures like weatherization or advanced wood heating that are going to be reducing emissions for 20 or 25 years to recoup that initial investment? So if the model is showing a home weatherized in 2049 or an advanced wood heating system installed in 2049, it's going to show the full cost of doing that up front, but only show 1 year rather than 20 or 25 years of emissions reduction.
Of savings. That's part of what's going on, Jared, with that. I'm not certain it's the whole thing, but that definitely is part of the reason that those switched. Yes, and all of the ideally you would run the analysis, you run the analysis out for another 20 years beyond, but the LEAP model and everything is run through 2050 right now. And so all measures, in essence, the end effects after 2050 are not captured here. That will penalize measures, as you're saying, that have a longer life, but all of them kind of are getting cut off there. So yep. Yes, that is part of what's going on, and wouldn't be,
So now with that introduction, and apologies for the delay, Brian, we're going to go right to your question, which is, since that full portfolio of measures do need to be implemented over the modeling period to achieve the emissions required by the Global Warming Solutions Act and as modeled in the Climate Action Plan, the CAP. Can you comment, David, on how policymakers should utilize those results to inform the selection of different policies and programs and how they're implemented? And doing that, is there additional analysis that you think is required there?
Thank you, Brian. Another good question. And I think, to me, I don't know, people are perhaps aware there's a thermal sector analysis RFP out from the ANR, one of the things that's really important is to take these measures and kind of map them into policy frameworks. So how much of what activity are we going to get based on if you've adopted a clean heat standard, or if you have a carbon tax, or if you have, the portfolio, the LEAP analysis, the pathways analysis says, if we had these measures, we would be able to meet our global warming solutions requirements. There's a mix of measures out there. And there are policies that, it's the mapping of the policies onto the measures. And yes, the measures have different marginal avoided costs, but there's not just a one-to-one, so the next level of analysis, and I think, and it's to a degree, builds on where ANR is looking to go. And for policymakers, it's still potentially to be determined, is a clean heat standard better than a carbon tax, or is how far do we get with a prohibition of any new fossil gas hookups, that type of thing. So mapping those policies into the levels of activity, it's very useful to have the modeling that shows us this is the level of activity, this is the type of heating systems that we need in our houses and businesses to reach the goals, or this is the type of vehicle fleet we need. The policies that get us there most cost effectively, those are still some of the open questions for policymakers as well as analysts to try to dig into more.
Thanks, David. So the next question, let's start with you for this one, Lee. This question comes from Vince O'Connell, who asks, has a cost model for storage been studied? And if not, Lee, can you talk a bit about how you think that question should or could be addressed?
Well, a cost model for renewables with storage is part of NREL's standard scenario analysis. And so they are mapping out what they think the cost of storage will do over the next 30 years. I haven't studied that in detail, but I also think from a Vermont's perspective, we know how battery costs have come down and will come down in the future. So solar with storage is finally becoming cost effective, if you will, but utilities have to pay for the ancillary benefits of what that storage does. It can do frequency regulation. It can do a lot of important things that have to be priced right in the market. And I'm interested to see that Green Mountain Power has a new tariff coming out where you're allowed to use if you allow them to use your battery system for frequency regulation and other things, they'll pay you $12 a month. So this market is starting to happen. But the other thing I want to see in Vermont is that we can do a lot without batteries. We can do a lot by making sure loads are on during times of peak solar periods, by managing our loads a lot more, and simply turning off your refrigerator for 10 minutes. All these kinds of load management, if customers allow the utilities to help them, can be done very, very cheaply and can make a huge difference. So that's the real future I'm looking forward to, is where we not only have storage coupled with our renewables, but have really good micro load management at the building level that allows this to all happen automatically, because the biggest battery we're all sitting on is our homes and buildings and the appliances in them. I hope that answered the question and didn't go off track.
No, that's great, Lee. And Vince actually replied to his initial question, commenting about demand response incentives. For the next one, and this, David, really kind of follows up on and continues your response to Brian's question about, the relation to MAC curve and policy modeling. This is from another EAN senior fellow, Linda McGinnis, who says, these are both excellent studies. Thank you both. David, I'm curious as to whether you have completed scenarios and graphs that illustrate the impact of not adopting certain major policies, e.g. TCI, the Transportation and Climate Initiative, or the CHS, the Clean Heat Standard, on the medium and long-term results. Obviously, this would require assumptions on the impact of those policies. Do you want to comment on that, David?
Yeah. Again, I think a good question, good observation, and kind of commentary on where Vermont is currently to figure out what are the, the clean heat standard is one way that could have gone forward for the building sector, potentially on hold now with the RFP out from the ANR to compare and contrast, not just looking at what does the clean heat standard do, but what does the clean heat standard do versus other alternatives. And so there's not a curve that specifically right now looks at the individual policy sets and compares and contrasts them against each other. And that's a little bit more of now the evolving kind of next scopes of work. And I think it hopefully will be important and helpful to inform policy decisions going forward. With some of these, I mean, you could do kind of a backhand of saying, it's more like if you took out what's in the model right now, phases out, say, the internal combustion engine light duty vehicles by 2035. If you take those out, you won't meet the requirements. So there are some, what we're calling the measure sets, the bundles of measures, that if you took those out, so if there's not some policy that leads you to a phase out of sale of fossil internal combustion engines by 2035, you're not going to meet the requirements.
Well, we've got just a few more minutes left in our scheduled time, so I'll probably just ask one more question. Perhaps we'll have time for two, but another question from Jeff Forward, and I imagine you both may want to comment on this, but Jeff says that there are positive economic development benefits associated with in-state renewable generation. Can you talk about whether economic development benefits are included in societal benefits, David? First, please.
The benefit cost elements that are included in the pathways analysis, there was a discussion of the economic impacts using what's called the in-plan model, and some discussion too of jobs in different sectors. But the benefit cost, that summary, and then the charts that I showed on that do not include those. And so for those aren't directly included. So there are additional economic benefits. Jared, you've done a good job over the years of identifying that, look, this is money that then stays in the Vermont economy as opposed to paying for fossil fuels that's outside of our economy, et cetera. So there are some analysis and support for that, but the benefit cost results that I'm showing here don't include those direct or those economic impacts, economic development impacts.
And I'll just note briefly that analysis that David talks about of the kind of dollar flows and how much stays in state and recirculates in the Vermont economy versus how much leaves for different energy resources is included in our latest annual progress report for Vermont, which was just published a little over a month ago and is available on the EAN website. But the short answer there is that, fossil fuels are 100% imported into Vermont. The latest figures from the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, which are backed up by VEIC analysis, is that on average, different fuels, it varies, and it can depend on what the wholesale versus the retail prices on these commodities. But generally speaking, if you average all of the fossil fuel expenditures in the Vermont economy together, about 75 cents of every dollar that is spent on fossil fuel drains out of the Vermont economy. Whereas in contrast, a dollar spent on electricity on average in the Vermont economy, whether to power an EV or a heat pump or whatever you're using electricity for, 70 cents of that dollar stays and recirculates in state. Well, with that, there are some more questions here. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but this has just been an incredible set of presentations. Thank you both so much for your work and for taking the time to present it.